I don't know how familiar you are with the structure of perversion in the clinical sense. Maybe we could capture a few points about perversion for Lacan and Freud before we jump into this section, if that would be useful, given that I was just reading about it as a review for myself from Bruce Fink's wonderful introduction to Lacanian psychoanalysis. Because I often forget why perversion matters and actually what perversion is, and frankly, what the difference is between disavowal and repression, right? Because they are two different things, right? So perhaps a few statements about perversion before we jump in would be perhaps useful. A couple points I wanted to just throw out there for you guys. The pervert, importantly for Lacan, refuses the sacrifice involved in enjoyment, which all other structures except for psychosis participate in. So that's an essential part of it, and that also involves a propping up of the law. And when we say a propping up of the law, in most cases, what that means is, in a clinical sense, a propping up of the paternal function. The paternal function. That's what's going on in perversion, and the subject is basically struggling to bring the law into being, to make the other exist, as we saw with Pascal. And but in neurosis, the situation is a little bit different. So in neurosis, we're dealing not with disavowal, but we're dealing with repression. But in both repression and disavowal, what is going on is a repression or a disavowal of thoughts, not of perceptions. And therefore, this idea of contradictory repression of thoughts in neurosis functions on this, I want to sleep with my stepmother, but that's repressed. So then what is actually consciously uttered by the subject is that I don't want to, right? So it's a different form of repressive denial. But in perversion, it's actually a very different structure because that contradictory point is not acknowledged, right? So there's like that point is not negated. So it's almost like an anti-dialectical relationship. I don't know if you guys have thoughts on this or want to jump in on this. It's very strange. Like perversion, that's also part of the reason why I think perversion is actually technically quite rare, or like the structure of disavowal is quite rare. And this is something I wanted to raise with you guys, which is, how do you guys understand the rarity of perversion in the clinic with the social, let's call it like the social reality of perversion tied to capitalism, or, tied to what Lacan calls absolutization of the market? That I think is very interesting, because the pervert creates what Lacan calls a symbolization, right? That is not based on the same structure of contradiction as the neurotic does. And so what, for Freud, by the way, this structure, if it's not based on contradiction as it is in neurosis, is based on what Freud calls a splitting of the ego, right? And so that splitting of the ego has to do with a disavowal. This is the key point. If the contradictory negation in neurosis of I don't want to sleep with my stepmother, what is actually being negated is a pleasure tied to the drives. In perversion, what is being negated, this is a key point, is a point of external reality tied to the father function, tied to the paternal function, according to Lacan. That's the key difference between neurosis and perversion. It's about this perversion having a touchstone point with external reality. And then, of course, Bruce Fink makes a beautiful point about how really over the course of Lacan's teachings, Lacan would come to really develop a much more involved conception of objective reality in the notion of disavowal, because one of Lacan's points about perversion is that Freud never clarifies this notion of the splitting of the ego as disavowal of objective reality. Fink argues that Lacan clarifies this undeveloped point in Freud. So, like, it's an example of Freud making this claim. I forget the exact reference or essay in Freud, and then Lacan further finishing it, if you will, or further elucidating the structure of disavowal. Okay. So again, the ego splits itself off, and the contradictory idea is maintained side by side within the subject, right? That's the key point. The other key point that Fink says, and then I'll stop here, is that the pervert refuses, this is the idea of sacrifice. The pervert refuses to hand over their enjoyment to the other. They refuse that surrender or sacrifice of their own enjoyment, right? Which the obsessive and the neurotic do, right? And the reason that the pervert refuses to give up on their pleasure has to do with the way that the pervert relates to the mother, right? That's the structural clinical point, which is that the pervert is basically functioning as the mother's substitute. So oftentimes a pervert in the clinic will be a subject for whom their mother has an unhappy relationship to their lover, and they have chosen the child, the pervert, they've chosen their penis to stand in for the father. That's the most common appearance of perversion in the clinic, according to Bruce Fink, which I thought was pretty precise and pretty interesting. So therefore, the pervert in this sense is the mother's substitute. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful from a kind of clinical standpoint. But now let us jump in. This is quite interesting because Lacan is obviously doing a lot here, right? So perhaps we might like to. It's not that long of a section, so I think we can easily get through this for our allotted time. Would somebody perhaps like to begin reading? Well, perhaps Matilda might like to kick us off. I feel uncomfortable skipping things because Lacan will say something mundane, but you never know if it's exactly mundane. So maybe we should start at the beginning.
I'll read for a bit. Just tell me when to stop.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Okay. Today I'm going to lay out some first truths. It appears not to be pointless to return to this ground, and it seems moreover difficult to organize the complementary fields that might allow us to get in tune with everything that is currently being produced, which is profoundly interested in what psychoanalysis has to say at this point in time. At our second to last meeting, I indicated that sublimation had to be investigated with regard to the role played in it by Ob J. Ob. It was this topic that showed me that it was, if not necessary, at least certainly not pointless for me to return to what specifies its function, and to do so with regard to the experience it grew out of, psychoanalysis such as it had been practiced since Freud's time. In that class, I was led to return to the texts by Freud that progressively established what is known as the second topography. It is certainly an indispensable echelon for understanding all the fines, as I would call them, I myself have proposed at the point at which Freud's search left off. I've already emphasized what the word cercare means in my speech, revolving around a central point as long as something remains unresolved. Today, I will try to indicate the distance at which psychoanalysis has remained up until my teaching from a certain exposed point that was formulated everywhere in the experience that preceded it, namely the function of objet L. Could you scroll up a little bit? Thanks. It was sketched out in certain statements, but was never totally purified, resolved, or developed. I won't say that I need to correct it, but that I can now at least justify taking some further steps. Any comments, or should we keep going?
So are we clear on this notion of Sikare, this notion of revolving around a central point as long as something remains unresolved? Is this clear to folks? This is a reference in my understanding, and please, for those who were with us with the two sublimation section, this is the right, the question of the like, right, like, so if sublimation is about an aiming of a drive towards a region, right, that is a response to what? It's a response to the crisis of the excess of jouissance, of the pleasure principle, right? So there's this kind of region in which sublimation aims that is different than that, and that's the region of the thing, or the das Ding. So is that what that word there is referring to? If anybody wishes to jump in on that to clarify, that might be useful. If not, we can proceed.
I'm not sure it's just that. Like, I mean, it also just seems like this repeated motif of kind of like revolving around a problem, like say in a clinical sense, but then like society revolving around a problem, like in a historical sense, and then like like which one is a real break in revolution, like so sort of so true and false resolutions of like problems. So I think there is sort of this. I think it's sort of a reference both to individual psychoanalysis, but a kind of extension to, like in this kind of sociological sense.
Yeah, that's helpful. No, that's very helpful. I think that's what's so interesting about this seminar, is that uncanny social commentary, which again, I mean, I've read several of Lacan's seminars, and we rarely get this full-throttled sort of immersion into social critique as we get in this one. I can continue to read in this section, Matilda. What I wish to say about sublimation today explicitly concerns works of art. And we remember this idea of from the ethics seminar about the function of sublimation as the work of art. I could recapitulate that, but perhaps he will do so. So I'll just continue. Freud broaches them with awkward prudence, not allowing himself to view them in any other way than as having commercial value. They are things that are pricey and whose prices are undoubtedly incomparable, but not that different from any other prices once they are put on the market. What must be stressed is that their price is given to them by a special jouissance value, a value related to what I isolate and distinguish in my discourse as jouissance, jouissance being a term that is only established by being evacuated from the other's field, and thereby from the position of the other's field qua locus of speech. It is clear that the function of object A interests us in relation to sublimation. If object A can function as equivalent to jouissance, it is owing to a topological structure. To realize this, it suffices to consider the function by which the subject is founded and introduced only as a signifying effect, and to refer back to the schema that I drew on the board for you 100 times since the beginning of the year, that of the signifier as the representative of the subject before another signifier, which by its very nature is other, different from the first signifier. Owing to this, what represents the first signifier can only be posited to be prior to the second. Hence the need to repeat the relationship of S, capital S to capital A, qua locus of the other signifiers. So we here see figure 16.1. This is something that we're already familiar with. I think that this makes decent sense to me. Is everyone clear on this? I suppose the first claim that could trouble us would be this precise one up here, which is that jouissance is only established by being evacuated from the other's field, and thereby from the position of the other's field qua locus of speech. So this I take to be a fundamental split or distinction between enjoyment and desire, where desire is located on a topological sense as outside of enjoyment, that there is a non-rapport between desire and enjoyment. Then you have to ask why that is the case. And I think that the reason for that we saw 4 sessions ago in his conversation about Freud's beyond the pleasure principle itself. Meaning that jouissance has a certain like a incompatibility with the subject. If others want to jump in on that, or if it's already clear, we can move on.
I feel like there's another way of saying it, as maybe like, and he says this at the end of this lesson, that primary narcissism is an illusion to Lacan. So meaning like we can never rejoin with like jouissance or whatnot.
Yeah.
And that
here,
that's
really helpful.
And that here we're seeing it like jouissance is like posited after like there's the evacuation from the field of the other, or like as speech is introduced or something, something like that.
Yes, that's very helpful, and this is going to be really helpful for us as we transition into the next section, as Lacan takes on this thought as censorship, and the Freudians who argue that revolution and that social movements, right, for let's say like social movements for equality or May 68 in general, right, they will argue that what is at work here, right, is a collective desire for a refusion, right, with primary narcissism. And I think that Lacan is trying to make a claim that this is not psychically the structure that is at play with revolution, because the subject ultimately does not find the homeostasis that it's looking for in such a re-immersion. I mean, this is the same debate that I think Lacan would have with the Kleinians as well, right, over the status of the mother. So go ahead, Luis.
I think it's important to differentiate aesthetic experience from the work of art, especially as it is understood in the art market, because it's not just, I think it's not just that you perceive a beautiful object and that's how you can identify the object A, but it's how much value other people give to this work of art, right? And especially in the art markets, it can be something that is not it's not beautiful for you, but it is pricey. Others, find it valuable, and that's how this becomes an object of the other, right? Not precisely for you, but I mean you desire because it's the object that somehow the other desires, that completes the other, right? In the art market especially.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful, yes, because it's the art market for Freud had to do almost with a logic of equivalence vis-a-vis the market. And Lacan is wishing to say that the value of art is not reducible to the logic of capitalist equivalence, is what I see him saying here. Let's continue to see. This relationship leaves intact the locus in which I've written A. It should not be understood as a part. Everything that's stated in works on set theory about how sets function, their elements potentially being sets in their own right or being under the authority of sets and puissance de ensemble, justifies us in equating this residue, although distinct owing to the function of A, to the weight of the other as a whole. Okay, as an ensemble. Okay, so let me just reread that. Okay. Okay. So in set theory, the authority of sets justifies us in equating this residue, although distinct owing to the function of A, to the weight of the other as a whole. 1 second, Matilda. Object A is located in a place here that we can characterize with the term extimate, combining the intimate with radical exteriority. It is insofar as object A is extimate, and purely in the relationship instated by the establishment of the subject as a signifying effect, that it gives rise to a rim structure in the field of the other. Go ahead, Matilda, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to elaborate on what's going on right there. Is he's saying that in this repetition of signifiers where we're trying to refine jouissance, there's a substitute because we'll never refine it, but there's nonetheless this repetition and this difference that this mechanism that churns.
Yeah.
And that objet A acts as a substitute for this process. It acts as a substitute for jouissance because it has a certain topological structure that allows it to act as an equivalent for jouissance. And I mean, he's basically saying that this diagram that he shows is giving us a rim structure because objet A is actually outside. It's extimate and follows a signifying logic. Therefore, it has a rim structure, and therefore it can substitute for sexual jouissance.
What do you mean by that last phrase? It can substitute.
He says that a rim structure is proper to the drives because maybe sexual jouissance has a similar structure. But I mean, in this very abstract sense, objet A with its rim structure, that topology allows it to be a substitute for jouissance in the process of difference and repetition, perhaps something like that. In the research that's ever driving towards refinding jouissance, objet A is somehow the substitute that the process works upon in lieu of the evacuation of jouissance from that field or something. I don't know.
Okay, yeah. I mean, part of what I'm confused about here is the reference to artwork, because he's introducing sublimation and then artwork, and then he's talking about the extimate rim structure of object A. So it's kind of 3 conceptual things going on at once. And we know in artwork that the object A in a painting, right, that there you can almost pinpoint the point of the object A. The question as to like the sublimation, though, right? If object A in sublimation is that which tickles das Ding, right? And sublimation aims towards das Ding, right? And Freud was too prude to understand that artwork is not reducible to just like market value. I'm not sure exactly where he's going with this, but I suppose he's trying to set up this topology, right, of object A, and then we'll see where he follows us. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in, but that was very helpful. Because yeah, I mean, as you see, A here is extimate. A there at that in 16.1 is both inside and outside. Yeah, I suppose this, I mean, all of these different the cross cap, the torus, and so on have this two-dimensionality or three-dimensionality, and they are probably better represented like that than they are here, but let's see what he says about this. He says, we can easily discern a variety of rim structures. We can choose, as it were, to join up one from in the form of a sphere, which is apparently the simplest of topological structures, in which the rim is sketched out, joins up at a point. Okay. 2, we can envision the form of a torus, where the opposite edges join, each point in one vector joining up with the corresponding point in the opposite vector, and 3 in the form of a cross cap. 4 in the form known as a Klein bottle, by combination of the two possibilities of joining opposite vectors with the same orientation point to point, or joining opposite vectors with different orientations. So that's 16.2. And then he says it's easy to perceive the kinship between these 4 topological structures and the various objects A, of which there are also 4. And again, those rim structures of object A, by which there are 4, we know those are the primary erogenous zones in the body. Go ahead, Luis.
Just to go back to the work of art, right? One thing we can add is that I mean, you can exchange, money for the piece of art, but you will never buy the A, right? The A will be just from your experience, right? Of your interaction with the work of art, but it cannot be exchanged, right? But that's one way
helpful. That's helpful. But I'm also thinking of that painting, The Ambassadors, that Slavoj always talks about, where you have that point in it, which is like the obscene object that stands out, but is also like a stand-in for the emptiness in the painting, which I think is also associated with object A. So I have a struggle in my mind to conceive of object A as the like what you're saying, this kind of like that which is most essential, versus this representation of a paradoxical absence. But
it's also like at the very end of the chapter, this is sort of like reiterated, like where he sort of mentions on 222, he mentions the Daphnia. And he has a really interesting example there where he's talking about a kind of pink shrimp that when it gets stripped of its exoskeleton, so it has to bring a few grains of sand back in because it needs that to constitute a real ear, which, it needs something to tickle it from the inside. But that thing can't be off the thing itself. So it has to be sort of extimate but I mean, this also seems to be like an allusion to mitochondria and kind of like, I don't know, exaptation, like sort of the, like symbiosis and supplement at the root of life in a kind of...
Right.
So I feel like he spends a long time meandering, but then in the conclusion, he restates it like really clearly, which is...
Right. Yeah, because you see that demonstration on 222 that you just mentioned of this sea creature, exoskeleton, extant body, is used as a metaphor immediately following that of the relationship of the internalization of the voice of superego. And he's showing that that internalization of the superego injunction is also a process of extimacy for the subject, which, by the way, he is interested in clarifying his position on these things as a response to the conservative manifesto against May 68, which we will read about next time. The one that was written against Wilhelm Reich by Chessoe Smirgel. Her last name is Smirgel. So I think that's actually what's actually literally like driving Lacan, right, to reference these things, precisely because he believes that they have a vulgar conception of the mutations in the superego authority that's happening in our culture at this time. So okay. All right. Okay. I'm simply pointing out here, and I'll return to it later, but I wish first to remind you of the concrete function object A plays in clinical work, or differential diagnosis in La Clinique. Before object A can possibly exist, thanks to the methods involved in its production, in the form that I qualified earlier as commercial, it is in a position to function as a locus in which jouissance is captured at levels precisely exemplified in clinical work. I am going to skip straight to the nub of the subject to which my first remarks in coming to talk to you today perhaps provided more detours. Okay. Would somebody like to read at the top of 2 on 215? Now it's getting good here. Anyone can jump in as they wish.
Yeah, I could read.
Hell yeah.
What's up, everybody?
What's up?
In Freud's theoretical work, the relationship between neuroses and perversion was very quickly spelled out. How did it, in some sense, force Freud to take notice of it? Freud worked at the outset with neurotic patients who had all sorts of problems, and their narratives tended to lead him to examine what initially struck him as traumatic experiences. Nevertheless, the way in which these experiences were received, so to speak, by apparently traumatized subjects created a problem, and the question of fantasy arose, which is clearly at the crux, or nucleus, of everything related to the economy for which Freud selected the term libido. Yet, must we still truly believe that neurotics fantasies allow us to reclassify perversion, to handle it anew from the outside, on the basis of experiences that did not derive from perverts? In the same era, people were descriptively presenting the so-called field of sexual perversions. Need I remind you of the names of Krafft-Ebing and Havelock Ellis? Let us note that Freud's first take was already topological in nature, since he opined that perversion was the flip side of neuroses. He already sensed something that gestured toward the surfaces that interest us so deeply, owing to what happens when they are cut. Neuroses was perhaps a bit too quickly presented as a function with different stages compared to perversion, and as partly repressing perversion, at the very least, as a defense against perversion. But very quickly, it appeared that simplifying things in this way did not resolve the problem in the slightest. And that's already like an echo of the beginning of something that's unresolved, right? That we're circling towards. That French word, caprice or something. Isn't it clear, and wasn't it immediately clear, that no resolution could be found by simply locating a perverse desire in a neurotic's narrative? If that is part and parcel of the spelling out and deciphering of the neurotic's narrative, the fact remains that the neurotic never finds his satisfaction in the treatment at that level. Similarly, in broaching perversion itself, it very soon appeared that it presents no fewer problems or defenses with respect to structure that neuroses does. In hindsight, it seems that all of this is related to an approach to technique whose impasses seem, after all, to have arisen merely because analytic theory was mistaken regarding the very ground we must stick to, whether in neurotics or perverts. If we instead consider things starting from the level that allowed us to articulate the return to our terra firma, that nothing happens in analysis unless it is related to the status of language and the function of speech, we obtain the mapping that I provided in my seminar entitled Formations of the Unconscious. I don't know if we want to meditate on the graph, but
Yeah, if you want to read first a little bit, then we can go back to it. If
okay.
you don't mind, just these couple paragraphs, and then we'll meditate away on that bad boy.
All right. It was no accident that I began from what is apparently the furthest regarding these formations, from what concerns us in clinical work, namely witticisms. It is on the basis of witticisms that I constructed this graph, which, although it has not yet revealed all its obvious features to everyone, nevertheless remains fundamental here. As you all know and can see, it is made up of a network of 3 chains, 2 of which are already marked, if not elucidated, by formulas, some of which I have amply commented on. Specifically, the formula, I don't know how to say these things, S bar diamond.
Here's a barred subject losange demand.
Perfect. Specifically, the formula S bar lozenge demand indicates the subject's fundamental dependence on something that is utterly distinct from need, namely demand. The signifying form, or quote unquote, the files of the signifier, close quote, as I put it, specifically demand, distinguish it, and do not in any way allow its effects to be reduced to the simple terms of physiological appetite. This is already necessitated, but turns out to be clarified by this medium, by the simple fact that needs concern us in our analytic work only because they come to be equated with sexual demands. I have labeled the other points of intersection. See the small figures in figures 16.3. Those involving a quad treasure trove of signifiers as a simple reminder here. I want to make a point now, since no one else has ever highlighted it. It's obvious that these 3 chains cannot be supposed, established, or fixed except inasmuch as there are signifiers in the world, that discourses exist, and that a certain type of being is caught up in that discourse, a being known as man or speaking being, only owing to the existence of a possible concatenation that constitutes the very essence of signifiers. Nevertheless, it is the lower floor of the graph that we can specify with the category that I called the symbolic. You see the symbolic function here with the possibility of a shortcut back, rhetoric core. See the right to left arrow between the 2 main left to right lines in figure 16.3. That occurs on the basis of a statement in the simplest discourse. It is at this fundamental level that we can assert that there is no such thing as a meta-language, and that nothing symbolic can be constructed except on the basis of normal discourse. In the upper chain, on the other hand, we can perceive that what is at stake is the effects of the symbolic in the real. Thus, the subject, who is the first and major effect of the symbolic, only appears at the level of the second chain. If something has not yet taken on its full weight, even though it is always brought out in my discourse, and especially this year, I love these hubristic claims just all the time. But since it is the object and it is on the basis of the object that I am making headway, it is the status of S barred A. It is the signifier that reveals the fundamental incompleteness of what is produced qua locus of the other, or more precisely, of what, in this locus, sketches out the pathway of a certain type of entirely fundamental lore. The other as a locus from which jouissance has been evacuated is not simply a scrubbed clean place, burnt circle, or place open to the play of roles, but something which in and of itself is structured by signifying impact. This is precisely what introduces therein the lack, bar, gap, or whole that can be termed object
Okay.
object A.
Okay. Thank you so much. So the first movement, let's call it, is the symbolic, for which normal discourse and no meta language is possible. The second is the symbolic touching the real, for which we get the S as barred subject emerge onto the scene. And then the third movement of subject barred other is the one that concerns us now, right? And that is what is our focus in a certain way at this moment. And that is the kind of graphical portrayal of this point we talked about before of how in order for object A to emerge, there is an evacuation of jouissance in the field of the other. Now, my first question here is taking us back to Pascal, because Pascal is a figure who understood or invents a way to believe in the other despite the other being barred, right? And then if also that means that Pascal is some type of inventor also therefore of the object A. So I think we should actually reread this last few sentences, because this relationship between S barred A is quite essential. If you don't mind, I'd like to reread it just so we're kind of just refresh, unless there's any questions. I don't think there is. Okay. If something is not yet taken on its full weight, even though it is always brought out of my discourse, and especially this year, since it is the object and it is on the basis of the object that I'm making headway, it is the status of S barred A. It is the signifier that reveals the fundamental incompleteness of what is produced qua locus of the other. Or more precisely, of what in this locus sketches out the pathway of a certain type of fundamental lure. The other as a locus from which jouissance has been evacuated is not simply a scrubbed, clean place, burnt circle, or place open to the play of roles, but something which in and of itself is structured by signifying impact. In other words, what I take that to mean is metonymy, right? Which is that the structure of the signifying chain is one of negation, the subject as a representative for another subject. That idea is not to be understood as almost like a mystical like vessel or emptiness, right? It's not a burnt circle. It's not like some kind of mythical place. No, it has a signifying structure to it. That is precisely what introduces lack. And that is precisely also the point at which the A object emerges. So that's actually very helpful, because we've looked at the graph of desire several times, right? And now I'm actually starting to see the emergence of object A in this upper quadrant here. That's where we're focused, right? Go ahead, Luis.
So I always had this question, what this S bar A actually meant. I don't remember where I read it, but Lacan claims that this is the signifier of the lack of the other, right? So not exactly the subject, right? Bar A, but the signifier of the lack of the other. Like for example, when we say there is no other of the other, right? Or there is a lack. This is a signifier itself, right? That to mean that there is no other of the other, right? There is no meta language, right? But there is this lack inherent to the other, right? The signifier that is inherent to the other that makes it incomplete.
Yes. Yeah, that's very important. The capital S is indeed signifier, not subject. Subject here in graph of desire is represented as barred subject. Akshay, please.
This is not a very analytic comment, but I kind of like I thought there was a sort of contrast being made between a scrubbed clean place, a sort of a place open to the play of roles, as sort of alluding to the symbolic and to sort of law and the superego. In the sense that it's also like a lot of like Durkheim and the sacred is often sort of defined as like, something that's kept apart. So purification and which implies its own kind of transgression. But this was something, I just really like the image of this is sort of like a real impact that like literally sort of punches a hole in the sense that, and that's, it forms a torus rather than like a sphere. Yeah, I don't know. So something about that signifying impact, and which, as later there's the reference to Sartre for, again, there's something about the impact of the other in your field of vision, which isn't like any other object, in that it sort of punches a hole into it that's kind of like ontologically incommensurate with like, the world of objects.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very useful. And of course, I feel like one of the Lacanian maxims is, at least if we're entertaining this notion of where Lacanian insights might coincide with spirituality or with religion, it would be that religion should be like a technology of the subject for finding some type of solace or something like this, precisely where the barred big other, right? Religion is only good if it's capable of coming to terms with the constitutive barredness of the big other. Go ahead, Matilda.
I wonder what significance, like we read a lot, there's like a lot in these pages, there's like 2 pages, like it ends with this comment about Esparte as a fundamental lure. But before that, there's an emphasis on the idea that the subject, who is the first and major effect of the symbolic, only appears at the level of the second chain. It's like, what was the point of emphasizing that sentence? Like, it's maybe emphasizing like an extra level of alienation in the subject or something.
Yeah, because it is, yeah, it's a reference to the like if you read Seminar 4 on Lacan's interpretation of the Oedipus complex, it's that like constitutive movement where a need is replaced by demand. And once that occurs, the subject then, as Lacan articulates it here, moves from a pivot from the symbolic towards the real. So that is the basic point, I would assume. So it's this it's this relationship to demand which is at work there. I think that's how I would say it, but I'm not exactly clear on it either. In a certain way.
There's this question I have, like, in reading these pages, is like just the general question of like, when the human like acts in the world, like, do we ever act directly with the objects, or is it always like clouded by this like maybe this transference of this like Oedipal situation that we project onto, like, that we experience reality with, like, so that like all of our actions can be referred back to like how we are dealing with this Oedipal situation or something. I don't know if that makes much sense, but it does seem to be the way like traditional psychoanalysis sees like societal conflict in a way or something.
Yeah. So I think that's fair. I think that's fair. I don't know if others want to jump in on that. It's go ahead.
Yeah, like it's a good question. Like, it's interesting because it's a very like Sartrean question whether or not we can relate to like authentic objects or something like this, in a way. But I think yes. I think yes and no, because like the consequence of like this lessons, the other as a locus, yada yada yada, like just the impact of the locus of signification as a consequence of our behavior. So it's almost as though we can have a like a direct experience with objects or something like this, but it's and that experience can be rendered communicable. And if it can, that's because we have made an impact on signification, right? So like it's almost as though like okay, like it's a difficult thing to communicate, but there's like a sort of like residue that is like, I don't know, let's say like uh perceptible in how it is that you're using language, something like this. So it's like in an indirect way you can communicate that sort of experience. This is how I'm reading it. I don't know if this makes sense at all, but like in other words, like I think if you can communicate those experiences, it's because you can communicate how you've impacted your relationship to like the big other in some way. But I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's incompleteness too. It's signifier that reveals the incompleteness of the locus of the other, right? So it's that coming to terms with that incompleteness, which is the basis of, as Matilda was saying, the end point of the talking here of psychoanalysis itself. At which point, of course, as it pertains to the Oedipus complex, Lacan will suggest in later seminars that this is something that is much more contingent, right? And in fact, is something that can be gotten rid of. So I think it's also, therefore, in ethics. There's an ethics of psychoanalysis, which is not necessarily wanting to reaffirm the authority of the Oedipus complex, which, as we will see in the next section, that's what the conservative Freudians are worried about with 68, because it's upsetting the structure of normality. And therefore, the task is to kind of re-stabilize it. Go ahead, Luis.
Yeah, so just to improvise, let's see if I can add up to what is going on. So in the first movement, the subject is created when it is interpolated by language, right? But we have to read it as the subject being kind of alienated from language. So what the other can be your own speech or someone else speaking, right? Is the field of speech in general. And then, of course, is chevoir. What do you mean by that, right? What do I desire, or what do you desire, whatever. And of course, this relates to how do you perceive the answer to be if it's coming from this other that you posit an answer to this desire, right? But Lacan will, of course, in this graph, explain that crossing this demand of what is the meaning is will not result in a meta language, but will result in an incomplete, like the impossibility of a meta language, right? There is no answer for this calling, right? The father will not come and tell you this is the path you have to follow, right? And this is the lack inherent in the other, right? It's not that there is, the father behind this void, but the void is within the father, right, or within the other.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah. Thank you very much. No, that's it's quite good. I mean, I think on the left-hand side, we have the constitution of the imaginary of small s A. And then on the right-hand side, we have just A. So I'm actually not sure what those marks are indicating, but I'm a little more clear on this barred subject losange demand as it relates to signifier barred locus of the other. Okay. Luis, perhaps you might wish to read on. We could start here at 3 with Freud strongly stressed.
Yeah, sure. So it says, Freud strongly stressed the importance of the oral and anal drives in psychoanalysis, considering them to be first a sketch called progenital of something that upon maturation will fulfill some sort of myth of completeness prefigured by orality, and some sort of myth of a gift or discharge of a present prefigured by anality. Isn't it strange that after having so strongly stressed these two fundamental drives, he leaves them far behind, at least apparently so, and that it is with the help of the scopophilic and sadomasochistic drives that he articulates a montage that involves the source, pressure, object, and aim? I'm going to suggest right off the bat that what the pervert does is not based on some sort of scorn for the other or partner, as people said for a long time. And as no one has dared to say for a while now, primarily because of what I have said about it, his conduct must be gauged in a far richer fashion to convey it at least to an audience like the one I have before me today, which is quite heterogeneous. I would say that the pervert is he who devotes himself to plugging up the hole in the other in order to flesh that out. I will say that he is up to a certain point in favor of the other existing. He's a defender of the faith.
Okay, so that's very interesting, because if we are focused here at the point in the graph of desire, which we talked about a moment ago, of the like Pascalian innovation, right? Or the Pascalian, what did Pascal preserve, right? Pascal preserves the God of the Old Testament, the God that transcends the authority of the book, the authority of the scripture, of the word, the God of the real. And that's very interesting then, because in that sense, Pascal is a pervert who is kind of aware. This is the thing that interests me. He's aware that the culture that he's living in has reached a point of a barring of God's coherence or God's existence. Undetermined, it's inconsistent, it's incomplete. There's sort of an awareness of that going on precisely amongst his class of the noblesse des robes and the kind of petty bourgeois class, we would call it today, right? But he creates a perverse solution to that impasse. And that's what this is. That's why he's a defender of the faith. Okay. I can continue. So moreover, if we look in this slide a bit more closely at the case histories that make the pervert an odd auxiliary of God, we can shed light on bizarre comments that are made by writers whom I will term morons. We read, for example, in a treatise on psychiatry, which is, by my faith, very well constructed with respect to the cases it compiles, that exhibitionists do not engage in their antics only in front of little girls. They also sometimes do so in front of tabernacles. It is certainly not such details that clarify things for us. We have to first locate something I already did a long time ago here, the isolable function of the gaze in the entire field of vision as it arises in connection with works of art. It isn't easy to define what a gaze is. It is even a question that can very easily sustain an existence and ravage it. At one point, I saw a young woman for whom this question, combined with the structure that I need not go into here, turned out to go as far as to lead to a retinal hemorrhage with long-lasting consequences. People wonder about the effects of exhibiting, for example, whether or not it frightens the witness who seems to provoke it. People ask themselves whether the exhibition is truly intends to provoke shame, fright, or some sort of echo, something that is either ferocious or consenting in her. But that is not what is essential to the scotophilic drive, which you can describe as you like, as active or passive. I'll leave you the choice. It appears to be passive since it allows something to be seen. What is essential is above all to make the gaze appear in the field of the other. But why? If not to evoke the flight of the gaze or vanishing point, or what is ungraspable in the gaze in its topological relationship to the limits imposed on jouissance by the pleasure principle. The exhibitionist watches out for or watches over the other's jouissance. What is it that creates the mirage or illusion here that the exhibitionist has scorned for his partner? It is that we forget that beyond the fact that the partner serves as a specific prop for the other, there is the fundamental function of the other who is always there, clearly present, whenever speech functions. The locus of speech in which any partner is merely included, the point of reference where speech is posited as true. So that's actually very interesting, right? Which is that otherness that is barred, that is discovered in psychoanalytic exchange of free association, by the way, which I remember him mentioning in the very first session of this seminar, is that which is inconsistent, but which also produces the object, precisely because of the unconscious, of the slips of the tongue, and so on. This kind of idea that if you speak freely, you produce in excess, which you could call a point of otherness, which Lacan here says purely from the standpoint of speech is the treasure trove, or the locus of speech, the point of reference where speech is posited. Okay, it is with regard to the field of the other quad deserted by jouissance that an exhibitionistic act is carried out in order to make the gaze emerge therein. It is in this respect that we see that it is not symmetrical to what happens in voyeurism. Indeed, what's important to the voyeur, and very often owing to the fact that everything that can be seen was in some sense profaned in front of him, is precisely to interrogate what cannot be seen in the other. Okay. So voyeurism is not symmetrical to exhibitionism. What constitutes the object of the voyeur's desire in a little girl's thin body is quite precisely what can be seen there, only insofar as she props it up on the basis of what is ungraspable, on the basis of a simple line where the phallus is missing. The fact that the voyeur, as a little boy, was so mistreated that nothing that might grab him about this mystery seems to hold the attention of an indifferent eye. This is what propels him all the more to restore to the other the thing that was neglected in him, to supplement the field of the other with it, unbeknownst even to what props it up. Here, giving jouissance to the other, which is the very aim of perversion, seems in some sense to escape owing to this unknowing. Okay. So in voyeurism, we have giving jouissance to the other, which is the aim of perversion, propping up, being a defender of the faith, making the other consistent, right? Making the other consistent with jouissance. Whereas in exhibitionism, you are watching the other where jouissance is absent. So the voyeur is dancing over it. The exhibitionist is watching it where it is absent. And here I'm thinking of what's that Hitchcock film in the apartment complex with the main character
Rear Window.
who watches. Yeah,
Yeah, Rear Window.
Yeah. That's what's going on here, right? That structure, if I'm not mistaken from watching the film, that gaze is interested in watching the other where jouissance is absent. So I don't know what that means to you guys. Let's continue to tease this out. This is a helpful distinction. This demonstrates, first of all, that no drive is simply the converse of another. Drives are not symmetrical. It also demonstrates that what's essential is the functioning of a supplement, something that as regards the other interrogates what is lacking in the other as such and makes up for it, fends it off. Certain analyses are exemplary here, and they are always the most naive ones. After having cast doubt last time on a certain philosopher, Sartre, for his lack of seriousness, it's impossible for me not to recall his extraordinary analysis of the voyeur, who endeavors to see through a keyhole what truly cannot be seen. Nothing can make him come crashing down more surely than being discovered while being captivated by this slit. It is no accident that a slit is also known in French as un regard, a gaze, and even un jour, a day, as in something that lets in the light of day. Being put in a humiliating and even ridiculous position is not at all linked to the fact that he is beyond the slit, but to the fact that he can be detected by another person in the posture of someone who, because he is so sure of himself, sees nothing. A posture that is demanding compared to the standing position solely from the standpoint of narcissism. So you see the man who's behind the keyhole watching the other has relinquished the possibility of being caught and therefore of his own humiliation, relinquished that because he has swapped or projected his position with the position of the other that he's watching. That's why he is beyond the slit. Okay. And 1 second, actually. You can easily find this analysis on a page in Being and Nothingness, an analysis that has something imperishable about it, despite the bias included in what is deduced therefrom as to the status of existence. Okay, please, Akshay, please.
I mean, yeah, it's not to be pedantic, but I wouldn't say that he's sort of relinquishing kind of I mean, it's sort of like his fantasy is constituted and around this notion of a position from which you can see and not be seen. And, because he was neglected as a child, if such a position existed, it means someone could have been observing him. And this is, even though he's been mistreated, this is the treatment he gives this other person. But the fantasy relies on the fact that he is not discoverable. And so, he's completely convinced he can't be discovered. But the minute he is discovered, and he lets the other person know that, oh, no, you should enjoy yourself. You are worthy of attention in the way that I never was. It ruins it. So it's like, it literally always escapes, because if they don't know, they don't know. And if they know, it's ruined. So in that sense, it's kind of like, I don't know, like a tragic kind of description.
Yes. No, that's very useful, because what is the status of existence for Sartre of the other? It is, if I remember correctly, the difference between Lacan and Sartre on this matter would be that Sartre affirms the existence of the other, whereas Lacan does not. But it's been a while since I've taught this section of Being and Nothingness. The following step is of no less interest. What then is object A in the sadomasochistic drive? People believe they've found the key to sadomasochism in the game played with pain, but then they immediately retract that and say that it's only amusing if the pain doesn't go too far. This sort of blindness, lure, false fright, and vague groping regarding the topic reflects, in some sense, the level at which every such analysis remains. Isn't it, in fact, the mask, thanks to which sadomasochistic perversion escapes our grasp? Doesn't it seem to you that highlighting the prohibition characteristic of this jouissance must, here too, allow us to locate what is at issue? So what he's saying there is that the lure of the other in the sadomasochistic drive, because it does not, because it cannot, because it is trying to fill that, it has also substituted its own subjectivity with the other, and that is what makes it so elusive. Doesn't it seem to you that highlighting the prohibition characteristic of this jouissance must here too allow us to locate what's at issue? That's very useful. Go ahead, Luis.
Yeah, I had to leave for a second, but I wanted to say something. So I didn't hear what you said before. Maybe you said it before, but I found it contradictory the fact that in the exhibitionism, the exhibitionist, of course, is trying to not call, but to bring up the gaze, right, of which he cannot see, right? But what is perverted, I think, because it's contradictory, that as Lacan says, the exhibitionist only enjoys when the other is enjoying, right? So it's kind of contradictory because you cannot see the gaze, but nonetheless, you know that the other is enjoying. So I don't know. I find that to be perverted, like that the pervert knows that the other is enjoying, seeing himself. Maybe he's disgusted, but the pervert thinks that the other one is enjoying. I don't know. Maybe.
No, I think that's correct. Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, the exhibitionist in some sense is like, where is enjoyment for the exhibitionist? It's absent, right? Whereas for the voyeur, it is present in the other. But for the subject as voyeur, which of course Lacan is making the claim that it is a structure of sadomasochism that is at work here. Go ahead, Akshay.
I think for both of them, in the sense that they're both perversions, they're both present in the other. But for exhibitionism, it's he knows, but the voyeur can't know. Like, I mean, but I think in the sense that they both plug up the other, like even the exhibitionist fantasy is about, putting something out there that he knows they want. It's still for the other in that sense. So yeah, I think that's true for like all perversions, at least so far.
I mean, even the voyeur. I mean, the voyeur. What is he talking about? He talks about the woman, the vagina, whatever, and it's a lack. But yet he objectifies it as an object, even though it is nothing. It's an object that it cannot be seen. He makes it an object visible. Like he sees what cannot be seen. It's kind of like the other one. He knows the enjoyment, even though he cannot know what is behind that gaze.
Right. Yes, I think that's exactly right. And that reminds me of the idea that the pervert in a clinical sense puts a prop up for a failed paternal function, usually having to do with a compensation related to a mother who is all smothering over the child or over the subject, right? Perversion is born, again, according to Fink, in the clinical sense, typically by subjects that have a overly nurturing mother, but they have not foreclosed the father. No, if anything, unlike the psychotic, the pervert has a kind of ease for inventing the prop of the father, but they would never rely on the actual father. There's something defective there. So they find substitutes for the father in some sense. Okay. Doesn't it seem to you that highlighting the prohibition characteristic of this jouissance must here too allow us to locate what's at issue? This may strike you as overly daring or even as speculation that is hardly likely to lead to Einfühlung, empathy or sympathetic understanding, and for good reason, because perversion, true perversion, escapes the majority of you, regardless of what you may believe. It's not because you dream about perverse acts that you're perverts. To dream about perverse acts can serve an entirely different purpose, that of sustaining desire. Above all, something one truly needs when one is neurotic. This goes back to Lacan's careful comparison between like how perverse desire appears within neurosis. That does not authorize us in the slightest to believe we understand perverts. It suffices to have worked with an exhibitionist to realize that we do not understand anything about what, apparently, I will not say gets him off, because he does not get off, but he gets off all the same on the sole condition that we see what I just mentioned, namely that the jouissance at issue is the others. There's a gap here, of course. You're not crusaders. You don't devote yourselves to making the other, that is, something blind and perhaps dead, come. That's like a double entendre there in the use of come, right? But that interests the exhibitionist. That's the way it is. He is a defender of the faith. And then this reminds me of all of these Lacanians that analyze. This is before some of your time. Some of you may remember this, but during the War on Terror period, everyone was talking about the Muslim subject as perverse, right? Precisely because of this defender of the faith, exhibitionist, propping up another, you know what I'm saying? This kind of, I hated that whole, because it felt very racist from a Lacanian standpoint to do that. Anyways, I could give you book recommendations on that, but we don't have to do that. In order to give you a handle on exhibitionism, I allowed myself to talk about crusaders, about believing in the other, and about the cross. French words link up like that. Each language has its echoes and its coincidences. Croa, too, as Jacques Prévert said in Parole. So who is Jacques Prévert? I'm trying to remember. Does anybody know offhand? I think I looked this up at one point. Do you have it, Matilda?
Yeah, he wrote some famous screenplays in like the 40s and 30s with like some famous directors, and which were like kind of like hit French films after World War II or during it. And I think he also might have wrote novels or something.
I see. Le Croix, Crocet, it's like this Croyer, like it's this that's why like the French language lends itself to what is called homophonies, right? Like words that sound like other words that can be combined quite easily, I think is the point that he's trying to make. And this is what Prévert talks about in Parole. And you guys know what parole is in French? It's like that form of speech that is like almost infantile, right? It's like the form of speech is almost like babble, in some sense. Free speech in some sense. The speech of openness of free association, I guess. Okay. The Crusades existed. They too were waged for the life of a dead god that signified something just as interesting as it would be to know what has constituted the game between communism and Gaullism since 1945. It has had enormous effects. When the knights were crusading, love was able to become civilized in the places they left, while you see the interesting point here, right? Which is communism and Gaullism is paradoxical precisely because Gaullism was liberal authoritarian and communism under Stalin was communist totalitarian. But the difference is that remember what Lacan says about the Marxists, the communist scholars, is that they are morons precisely because they have this perverse desire. Right? They are more crusaders than the subjects of Gaullist France. Because the subjects of Gaullist France are these kind of revolting against a law for which they have no reason to believe in anything beyond it, right? It's that kind of Nietzschean nihilism that 68 brought out, right? Like we was just doing this interview on my podcast today. Do you guys know what the cause of 68 was? The cause of 68 emerged in a dorm dispute where there was a conservative prohibition placed on visitation rights between boys and girls in college setting at the University of Nanterre in Paris. That was the trigger of May 68, then spilled out, which, by the way, is very similar to the trigger of the free speech movement in Berkeley. Do you guys know what the trigger of that was? It's a very similar point, which was this imposition of these laws at elite universities like Berkeley of what they call in loco parentis, right? Which is this kind of like Fordist era welfare state conservative injunction for college kids to basically adhere to parental laws while the parents are absent. So it's kind of like making a paternalist law from the university as a parent. And so that provoked some of the initial responses. And I find that interesting. I don't know if you guys are aware of that. Melinda Cooper has a nice analysis of that if you're interested in her book on the family. Okay. It has had enormous effects. When the knights were crusading, love was able to become civilized in the places they left, while when they were elsewhere, they encountered civilization. In other words, what they were seeking, a high degree of perversion, and at the same time reduced everything to rubble. Byzantium never arose from the ashes of the Crusades. We must pay attention to such games, for they can be played again even now in the name of other crusades. Okay. That's a very interesting point he's making there, by the way. Because he's talking about how perverse collectives are destructive. So that's interesting. Go ahead, Matilda.
Yeah, this section's reminded me kind of this criticism of Sartre from last lesson, like where he was saying that Sartre would like instigate these young men towards like going to the barricades and like running into obstacles.
Yeah.
And it sounds like a crusader movement a little bit.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
the idea that he's like he's Lacan mentioned that like doesn't like what Sartre did because it's aggravating their castration anxiety. And like maybe that could mean like it's aggravating like the trapped youth. That's what he says is aggravating their castration anxiety, and like the idea that they don't realize they're serving a dead god. Like there's actually this other way of dealing with maybe the name of the father or something that's more responsible. Or I don't know what's being pointed to exactly here.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, clearly the homology or the comparison to the Crusaders, I don't think is something that he's making a comparison to the 68 students as subjects of like a perverse belief. I don't see it that way. I think he's making a statement that the battle between communism inside of France, like since the Second World War up to 68, whatever. Well, I guess maybe he is saying that actually. What he's saying is that the communists, much more than the liberal establishment, are on the side of a type of perverse belief. Akshay, what do you think?
I don't think he's saying that. I also really hope he's not. But I mean, okay, what I think he's saying is sort of socialism or barbarism, and Gaullism also in terms of like the Crusades, it has the kind of colonial savagery in like Vietnam and Algeria, and so you have this kind of like socialism or barbarism, right? In the sense of kind of, so I don't think it's a sort of condemnation of the protests. I would read the sort of disavowal of, what's her name, Shasugwe Smergel, I think, and sort of, yeah, I mean, I think that's what it is. But I mean,
yes, I agree. I think you're right. No, I think that's right. So I don't know, Matilda. Let's actually hold that insight, because it's a bit ambiguous. Till next time, we can explore that. Okay. All right. Let us turn to our sadomasochists, who are quite different. When it comes to the scotophilic drive, as I said earlier, there is one, the exhibitionist, who succeeds at what he must do, namely, bring the other jouissance, and another, the voyeur, who is there only to plug up the hole, with his own gaze, without letting the person he looks at see what she or he is to even the tiniest degree more. We find something similar when we consider sadists and masochists on the sole condition that we perceive where object A is located. Okay, so again, the exhibitionist succeeds at what he must do, which is to bring the other jouissance, and another who is there only to plug up the hole with his own gaze, without letting the person he looks at see what she or he is. Okay. It is strange that people don't perceive an essential function here, whereas we live at a time in which we have, in short, very clearly resuscitated all sorts of interrogation practices. There was a time when interrogation played a role in judicial mores at a high level. Now we leave that to agents who practice it in the name of some sort of madness, in the supposed interest of the nation or troops, for example. Already after the last war, the one in which so many things occurred, people prolonged the pleasure on the stage, sur les planchers, for a while by showing us simulacra, or little staged scenarios. In short, it's strange that people don't perceive the essential function played by speech in an interrogation, namely the confession. Sadistic games are not only interesting in neurotic dreams, we can see what is at issue when they're played out. Sadists may well have reasons for doing this or that, but we know that we must be wary of reasons. They are secondary compared to what takes place in practice. The latter, in fact, always involves peeling something away from a subject. What? What constitutes him in his fidelity? In other words, his speech. People could perhaps realize, nevertheless, that speech has something to do with it. I will indicate right away that it is not speech that is object A here, but it is a first sketch designed to set you on the right path. Nevertheless, approaching the question from this angle is likely to give rise to misunderstanding, for it suggests the very thing I'm refusing, namely, a symmetry between masochism and sadism. It is clear that the florid, real, true masochist, Sacher Masoch, himself organizes everything in such a way as to no longer be able to speak. Why is that so interesting to him? Let's take a close look. What is at stake is the voice. What is essential here is that the masochist turn the other's voice and it alone into something he can provide a guarantee for. A prop up, or serve as a grantor for, by responding to it like a dog would. That's clarified by the following. He seeks out a type of other who can be called into question regarding the voice. His dear mother, for example, as Deleuze illustrates, whose icy voice was permeated by every form of arbitrariness, a kind of voice that he perhaps heard all too often elsewhere, addressing his father, or from his father. Du côté de son père also completes and plugs up the whole. So there's a voice that he heard from elsewhere addressing his father, or from his father, also completes. Okay. So that makes sense now. So we can envision the Sartrean example of being in nothingness, of the subject behind the keyhole, the gazing onto another, enrapturing their gaze onto that other such that it erases any like self-consciousness on behalf of them being seen by the other. They have then inhabited the other. Now what Lacan is giving the example of here is the way in which the masochist utilizes a voice, which is a voice that is either, well, it's bound up with a voice that was either uttered to the father or is the father's voice itself, but it has the same structural effect. Okay, that makes sense. Yet there's something in the voice that is more topologically specific for this particular object A is what makes the subject most interested in the other, which is why the topological comparison that's illustrated here in 16.2 of the whole in a sphere must be rectified, because this specific sphere is not really a sphere, since it is precisely at the whole that it folds in upon itself. Okay, where is 16.2? So we can see that. Oh yeah, so it's way back up here. Okay, so which one is?
I mean, he's differentiating a sphere and a torus, and he's saying
Yeah.
a torus is a subject that has been like punctured by the symbolic in language, whereas a sphere is still like whatever, like not a person in a sense.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Luis.
Yeah, I think that one way to differentiate the what is was, the about voyeurism, exhibitionism, is that that relies on the imaginary stage, while here, the sadomasochistic
Yeah.
is on the symbolic stage, or playing with the symbolic. So, I mean, if before we were thinking about how the pervert is trying to supplement the mother, I think here we should say that how this pervert is trying to supplement the father, right? Trying to call the father by calling its, punishment, or embodying its punishment as the superego.
Yes. Yes, that's right. So then in that case, then it would be also constructed along the symbolic, no?
Yeah, on the symbolic. Yeah, because in this scopo, whatever, the exhibitionism and the voyeurism is more about images, how you can be the image, the ideal image,
Yes.
or how can you see that image too, right?
Yeah, that would make sense too, because in that sense, the voyeur is where jouissance is located, they're not, and it's absent, right? Where the exhibitionist is interested in its absent point. So that makes sense. Yeah, Matilda.
Yeah, because it's one thing for I was also thinking with Eddie mentioned when he talks about the Crusaders and how the students are part of that. I mean, I was thinking, how in French culture the protest it becomes a theater, in which people are kind of exhibiting themselves in that place where it's empty in society, trying to look good or trying to bring the gaze of the other, and enjoying if the other is enjoying, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, because that resonates like with the experience of like asking yourself at any protest, what is the other that our demands are being directed towards, right? That's a real, I think, background question that's at work. And often it's not like coherent, perhaps. Exactly. But I think Akshay is right that we should not understand this 68 students along the lines of a perverse subjectivity. I don't think that's the claim here, because if that were true, that would actually portend something quite strange about the logic of their demands. Although, of course, we have the famous phrase, which happens 1 year from this seminar, which is you are desiring a new master and you will get one. But I'm not sure
But
that
it's,
that's actually what Lacan's point
I,
is at this point.
I don't remember exactly, but what was the slogan of May XVI? If you remember, like,
Well, there's several slogans. One is demand the impossible. So there's this idea of demand, aimed towards a sense of incompleteness or aimed towards a point of impossibility. That's one of the main demands. There's
yeah, I mean, there
several
was,
other sites.
yeah,
I
I
mean,
don't
there's
remember,
like
but there was this slogan that, it was very libertine in its nature, right? So we can read it in this perverted way that, if we get rid of the prohibitions, we get the thing, this is what I can see the thing, I can hear the thing if I get rid of these prohibitions. So in that sense, it would be kind of perverted.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. In other words, in that sense that what you're saying is that they're aiming for the, well, that's actually, by the way, that's actually the main claim of what we'll see next week of Schmergel, which is their critique of Wilhelm Reich, which I think has a grain of validity to it, is that Wilhelm Reich is trying to abolish like repression, or the very like constitutive basis of repression as such in society, right? So they're trying to, if you like, make naked the other, right? To reveal the other as a kind of hostile force, or sort of like a full scandal. So there's something to that, which I'm not sure exactly that's what Lacan is trying to say, but go ahead, Matilda.
I'm just thinking about the masochism in the voice, and I'm wondering about how the voice is serving as an objet R that's like a substitute for jouissance. I guess I feel like masochism's important because masochistic jouissance was brought up like as what is symptomatic of Pascal's time, and I'm trying to connect it to these things. I'm still a bit perplexed.
Yeah. Go ahead, Akshay.
It's actually, I mean, it's so I mean, I guess he's sort of going, I think he's claiming that sort of in this particular imaginary situation, the masochist had a sort of arbitrary paternal or maternal function. And because of that, tries to construct an other who if he sort of responds to in a way that's completely, say, in a sort of master-slave situation where you obey like a dog, in the sense of sort of to give the other's voice the kind of potency that it can really command you. And of course, it only commands you because you sort of choose it, but nonetheless, it does. And so, it sort of compensates for an earlier sort of arbitrary voice. So I think that's the sort of, so I mean, in the sense that if the masochist is here sort of like, and he's citing Deleuze, for whom sort of masochism and not sadism is like defined by contracts. So sort of like, I give myself over, but I decide the terrain in which I give myself over. And that sort of makes it okay, right? Like, because I can at any moment sort of break the contract. But sort of, yeah, that's good.
That's helpful, yes. Would somebody mind reading, perhaps? I think we left off right at a close examination of what we find in certain organic structures.
I can read.
Whoever.
Please,
Oh.
go ahead. Whoever wishes.
Okay, a close examination of what we find in certain organic structures, for example, the apparatus of the vestibule or semicircular canals of the ear, show us radical forms that I already gave you a glimpse of a couple weeks ago when I mentioned one of the most primitive animals, the Daphnia. Let us add to it the crustacean known as Palemon, a kind of pink shrimp, a very pretty name full of mythical echoes. But we mustn't let this distract us from the fact that this animal, when stripped of its exoskeleton, as it is whenever it molts, has to bring a few grains of sand back into its outer open cavity, which, despite its lowly level on the scale of animals, is nevertheless a true ear, in order to tickle it on the inside. It does so for a good reason, for otherwise it could not move around in any way whatsoever. It is strictly impossible to conceptualize the function of the superego if we don't understand, and it's not the whole story, but it's one of the mainsprings, the function of object A realized by the voice qua support of signifying articulation, the pure voice insofar as it is or isn't instated in the locus of the other in a way that is perverse or not. A certain form of moral masochism can only be based on this point, the impact of the other's voice, not in the subject's ear, but at the level of the other that he establishes qua completed by the voice. Like the exhibitionist whose way of getting off we saw earlier, the masochist's gravitational center is located at the level of the other and involves handing the voice over to him as a supplement, not without a certain possible derision that appears in the margins of masochistic functionings. It suffices, I must say, to have lived in our times to realize that there is jouissance in handing the function of the voice over to the other. And this is all the more true in that this other is less able to be imbued with value, having less authority. Of all the imaginable perverse jouissances, this method of purloining or stealing jouissance may, in a sense, be the only one that is ever fully successful. The same is certainly not true for sadists. They too try to complete the other, but in the opposite way, by taking speech away from him and imposing their own voice on him, even if that generally fails. It suffices in this regard to look at Sade's work, where it is truly impossible to eliminate the function of the dimension of the voice, speech, discussion, and debate. Sade tells us about the most extraordinary excesses perpetrated on victims whose incredible survival may surprise us. But every single one of these excesses is not merely commented on, but integrated on the basis of a spoken order. What is most astonishing is that the order gives rise to no revolt. Yet we, too, have been able to observe historical examples in which such things happened. Among the flocks of those who were shoved toward crematoria and concentration camps, no one apparently ever saw anyone even so much as bite a guard's wrists. The play of the voice finds its full register in sadism. Yet there is a hitch. Jouissance escapes here, exactly as in voyeurism. It's placed as masked by the astonishing domination of the object A, by the jouissance, but the jouissance is nowhere to be found. It is clear that the sadist here is merely the instrument of the supplement given to the other, but which the other does not want in this case. He does not want it, but he obeys all the same. That this structure of these drives, inasmuch as they reveal that a topological whole can establish all by itself an entire subjective conduct. You can see that every analysis that revolves around supposed sympathetic understandings really deserves to be relativized.
All right, thank you very much. Very nice. So a couple points I'll make and others can jump in, but I think this whole first point about masochism, where he says, of all the imaginable perverse jouissances, this method of purloining or stealing jouissance may, in a sense, be the only one that is ever fully successful. This is an example of this category of moral masochism, which a lot of Freudians have talked about, by the way, including Edmund Bergler, the famous Freudian of the inner circle who wrote about the superego. He wrote a lot about moral masochism, right? And I think a lot of philosophers have talked about moral masochism in our culture as this like you might say how the subject internalizes the injunction of like self-singularization, right? So you can even think about like pressures on the body for like a woman to fit a certain appearance or to be a certain size, etc., gives rise to a moral masochism in which there becomes a repetition of an obsession of inducing pain onto oneself, right? Or even like I don't know, like excessive exercise or extreme sports, excessive jogging, etc. For Bergler, all of that was a way of confronting the excess of guilt at the foundation of civilization. But I think that Lacan is saying something about how that is no longer internalized by the subject in the same way as it was in Bergler and Freud's time, by the way, right? And then you have this other notion of moral masochism as what Lacan will later theorize as a beautiful theory of racism in television, right? Which is this notion of racism as the other is stealing my enjoyment, but in this case, the purloining or stealing of jouissance is producing some kind of masochistic pleasure. So it's bound up with that as well in an interesting way. And then, of course, this is even the most interesting, in my opinion, on 223, which is this idea that sadistic structures of social violence like the Holocaust or genocide elicit a passivity. Precisely, maybe not precisely because jouissance is evacuated, but what is left there is what Lacan calls object A, and it is able to exert an what he calls astonishing domination, but jouissance is nowhere to be found. So it's like an instrumentalization of an obedience structure, right? That also is, so there's two structures of ultimately drives that are going on here. And you could almost even really like graph these two structures out, these two distinctions. I like this. I mean, I wonder what you all think. I mean, I'm also thinking here of like a lot of new studies that have actually come out, which would challenge this idea that the subjects of the Holocaust never revolted, which we know is not true. Right? We see the same argument. It's a conservative argument, right? We see the same argument of conservatives when they reflect on the pre-antebellum experience of slaves in the United States, right? Or right in the 13 colonies, right? Where they said there was no revolt, right? So I don't know if what you guys make of that. I'm even thinking of Agamben's notion of the Musulman at the camp. A lot of it's maybe like too structural for its own good in some ways. Luis?
Yeah, I think when Lacan talks about that, the voyeurism and exhibitionism in the same way that the sadism, masochism are not symmetrical. So I think it's crucial to understand that the sadist is not exactly necessarily confronting a masochist, right? And the other way around, like it's not like you have a sadist and you have a masochist, right? Like, and they complement each other, right? So the sadist, of course, is confronting an object that is, I mean, it rejects its pleasure, right? And this is how it's because the masochist is enjoying, but only if the other enjoys too, right?
Right.
So it's not symmetrical. It's not symmetrical. So we cannot apply the same and say like, oh, in the Holocaust there was sadists and they were masochists. No, it will not apply like that.
That's true,
Uh,
but he's also saying that there is a strict structure of sadistic violence that produces a spoken order that adheres subjects to its dictates. And I'm just
mhm.
simply saying that that structure of domination is not perfect or total.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, does the Palestinian revolt? I mean, come on, it's like, come on, like, like
Yeah.
it's not. So there's a little something there that seems something to push back on, but I think you're right.
The
And
other
both
thing
of them
is,
are responding to this question of the whole, right? They're
yeah,
filling the whole
yeah.
in different ways.
Yeah, it's not like one is the subject and the other one is the other, like the complete other, right? Because it's asymmetrical. Both are confronting the other. The other
Yeah,
thing is that
totally.
in Seminar 11, Lacan talks
Yeah.
about the three voices. There is the active voice, like to see. There is a reflective voice, to be seen, and there is a passive voice, to be seen. Right? No, I'm sorry. The reflective voice, to see myself, and the passive voice, to be seen. Right? And they are not necessarily perverted. Right? What is perverted in Seminar 11, Lacan claims, is how the subject posits itself to be in that whole. Right? So, like sadomasochism in this case, like it relates to the invocatory drive, but it doesn't mean that the invocatory drive is necessarily perverted, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's helpful. That's exactly right. Thank you. So we have Connor, then Matilda, please.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of thinking about a lot of stuff right now, but this part, its place is masked by the astonishing domination of Objet A. Like the first time I read it, I kind of like just scanned over that, but reading it
Yeah.
all again with you this time was pretty illuminating because it just
Yeah.
clarifies like how it is that we may think about exhibitionism, perversion as basically just an analysis of forms of domination and how we participate
Right.
in those forms. But with
Oh,
that being
totally.
said, like I agree. Like when I read that bit about how like people did not revolt against the Holocaust, that did not humor me at all.
Yeah,
Like
that's something rubbed me the wrong way heavily there. Yeah.
absolutely. But yeah, I guess as a digression, like some part of this reminds me of like Jan Raymond's like critique of like Althusser, right? We can talk about interpolation and stuff like this, but he doesn't really have a theory of how it is that people resist against that
Yeah.
interpolation, so on.
Right.
And maybe there's some of that going on here, but I guess that's sort of my question. Like, so like, where are there? Is there an analysis here of like forms of resistance that's going on? Because in something like exhibitionism and perversion, it seems as though like the whole idea is basically that the exhibitionist is provoking the big other to affirm the law and dominate them, right? That's kind of like what's going on. And even in like masochism, this is where I'm thinking maybe something else might be going on, but because certainly in masochism there is this play of engaging in roles of being dominated. So that strikes, if we're just going to say that this is just like sort of indulging in what it means to be dominated, that seems very conservative, right? But
Yeah.
it seems as though there might be something else going on here that I'm just wondering if anybody else might be thinking about.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what others think, but I mean, I find that the most interesting concept here is this notion of the kind of, like, Burglar talks about it kind of like a purging. That moral masochism is a purging. That's why you have like why, like in Buddhist meditations, you sit in a position which is slightly uncomfortable, right? Like this kind of like minimal self-imposed suffering, right? Which is meant to deal with the problem, ultimately, you could say, I guess, of the drives, right? Of the repetition compulsion itself. So there's like, yeah, there's like some kind of like a, spiritual solution that has to be made. I think in both exhibitionism and voyeurism, you're dealing with a a problem of a crisis of the barred other.
Okay, yeah,
And the
just really
necessity of
quickly,
filling that.
it was
Yeah.
when you were talking about that, I was sort of thinking of yeah, it's kind of just like sitting with this thing, you know, and like maybe in sitting with it, like working through it maybe a little bit. And it's in that I was thinking about confession in regards to, and then just after confession, he starts to talk about masochism, but it doesn't
Yeah.
seem as he's talking about masochism in this sense that you're being interrogated and tortured, right? It's when he begins to talk about masochism, he talks about it in such a way that basically like a hen pecking mother, and the father just goes, okay, yeah. You know, there's this like immediate capitulation to the nagging, really. I can bring up
Right.
the return to it. But in any case, then like if we're looking towards like gestures towards how it is that we might sort of you know, further explore what it means to be dominated in our life, I think that's just it. You know, not merely capitulating to this sort of a thing, but being interrogated, you know, provoking, resisting just this sort of capitulation and confessing, you know, just how much it is that you like to be dominated or something like that. Really sitting with it. I don't know. I'm kind of just riffing a little bit, but
Yeah, that's
yeah, really
interesting.
sitting with
Yeah.
masochism, right? That's how you would do it.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's a sort of necessary processing of of constitutive guilt that is also, Lacan doesn't talk much about guilt, but I was reading this wonderful book on Lacanian affects, and the author Solette Colère Solaire makes the point that Lacan still affirms, even in all of these historical questions about trying to go beyond the Freudian horizon of civilization founded on guilt, Lacan still does affirm it. So I think there has to be some kind of like you know, technology of the self constructed to impose masochism onto oneself in ways that are like, I don't know, productive maybe. Go ahead, Matilda.
Yeah, I was thinking kind of along those lines of the masochism. He says that it's the only successful one, maybe the only like relationship with the drives that's like almost like a that is kind of like capitalism in a way, perhaps. And I mean, I mentioned that, and that like he's also referring to like the other having less authority in this situation, like reminding me of liberal power from the prior
Yeah.
lesson,
Yeah.
and how like there's almost something in masochistic jouissance where it's like we're turning ourselves over to the market to be ordered.
Yeah.
And okay,
No, that's really good. Yeah, that's really good.
I get extremely disturbed in these scenarios with Lacan, like where he says something like an entire subjective conduct can be revealed from this topological analysis, where I'm like, so it's like you get that quote and then you pair it with like that one earlier where it's like the partner is really not what's at stake here, it's like the other. There is the
Yeah.
fundamental function of the other who is always there, clearly present whenever speech functions. And so it's like, are we deriving all of our social concepts not from like actually dealing with like social reality, but like within this intersubjective sphere of like how we deal with the other as this like substitute for like social thinking? That's what freaks me out, is like thinking like we are deriving capitalism or capitalist relations from this relationship of the subject with an other. That's totally internal. And I mean, if that's what's occurring, it does disturb me. It's always a bit ambiguous, but he freaks me
Well, no,
out.
it's remember the clinical point that I mentioned from Bruce Fink's overview of what disavowal involves. Because remember, for the neurotic, they don't disavow, they repress. And repression produces like a 180 of that which is repressed in the unconscious, it is displaced and reappears in like the subject's conscious life, right? Whereas disavowal is slightly different than that, because it's a disavowal of not of something having to do with the what Lacan would call like the sexual drive, but it's a disavowal more so having to do with a piece of reality, therefore like with the field, with the social field. So when Lacan uses other, I mean, he's using that also, I think, to signify that it's also like other could stand in for like symbolic. It could stand in for like the social relation. It could also, I think, stand in for the locus of signifiers. So there's like multiple levels. I don't think that we need to worry that he's rendering otherness as this spiritual, like Levinasian religious conception. I wouldn't say he's doing that, but maybe Akshay agrees or disagrees.
I'm sorry for all of the opinions, but I mean, Matilda, I mean, I guess like I would read him as reading against a sort of the Oedipal triangle is the only thing that really exists, and it sort of overcodes everything else. And like, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for sort of anti-Oedipus, which I think tries to sort of historicize, using a lot of anthropology, kind of like different modes of the cathection of the subject by desire. And I think he's largely sympathetic with that. I think that all of his references to history, to totem and taboo, are sort of like, so it's not mother-father, but it's like that the mother function and the father function are always already social, in the sense that, yeah, it is your father, but your father is also perhaps a postman, and maybe he's getting fucked by the American state, right? So like, it's in that sense, like the Oedipal triangle sort of is in society and includes it. So, and I think you'd be arguing against this kind of impulse to go like, on the basis of the individual psyche, we can make grandstanding kind of political claims, like the May 68 protests are sort of like some infantile perversion or whatever. But that's my reading. I have no authoritative backing.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. I think, well, let's just put it this way. I think it is undecided where Lacan falls exactly on 68. It's highly ambiguous, highly ambivalent, rather. He is ambivalent towards it, I think, at this stage. Next seminar 17, it's actually he becomes more resolute on it. And yeah, because he offers an interpretation on the desire of the libertines in 17. Right? Here he doesn't really do that. So maybe that's a merit of this seminar in some sense, because everybody is kind of scandalized by his interpretation next year. Okay. And of course, Anti-Oedipus has not yet been written, but I do think you're right. There are elements of Anti-Oedipus that he finds constructive, and other elements that he would reject, right? Okay.
I mean, in a minimal sense, I think he admits enough history, right? Like that you can't just talk about, like, you can't generalize the bourgeois family to a kind of like transhistorical concept, because it just isn't like empirically, right? Like I think he would, however far he would go against anti-Oedipus, I think he would still insist upon that. Like, and so would Freud, even in a reading of like Totem and Taboo, or sort of like, in that sense, I think like history is not, it's dealt with psychically, but it's not, if it's evacuated, then I think that's when psychoanalysis genuinely becomes sort of bourgeois ideology.
I agree. Oh, I definitely agree. But again, I mean, like Lacan is not trying to transcendentalize the name of the father. He's not comfortable with doing that, and it's clear as he progresses that this is not, like, for example, what he's trying to do. Luis?
Yeah, when it comes to the loose, I was thinking how Deleuze will deal with this perversion, right? And his logic of sense. I mean, I don't know too much, but how will he deal with the fact that you can actually sense, what is beyond this, what is you can sense and sense. You can see what you cannot see, right? I don't know, but will it be a problem for him, or will perversion just be another form of, of phenomenological experiencing of the world?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, I'm not sure. Like I feel like in some sense Deleuze in the text to read is not logic of sense. It's a text called Coldness and Cruelty on masochism, on masoch, that very well known.
Yeah.
It's very short actually. And Lacan praises that text in future seminars, or maybe prior. I forget exactly when it's published. No, but I think first of all, the thinker of masochism, Masoch himself, Deleuze has a lot of praise for. I'm not sure that we can say that Deleuze has an indifference to the perverse subject or something like that. I'm not sure that also that he would believe or subscribe to these codified three structures of perversion, neurosis, and psychosis, by the way, because anyways, that's something for us to, I can review that text. I've read it. And incidentally, in our study group on Byung-Chul Han's Capitalism and the Death Drive, he raises it quite a lot, and we analyzed it there. Let's finish this because we're over time. We just have a little bit left. All right. All of this had to be rather carefully stated. I end up spending quite a bit of time on it, and we only have a few minutes left. I'll thus confine myself to indicating what the neurotics problem is. Have a look at my article entitled Remarks on Daniel Lagache's Presentation in the Écrit, which is indispensable for finding one's way about in what is out of joint in everything Freud says about identification. Vacillation is manifest across his works, and his statements about what he calls the reservoir of libido clearly contradict each other. He makes it into the ich ego at times, namely narcissism, and into the id at others. The ego, obviously being inseparable from narcissism, finds itself in a problematic position. It's by offering up an object to the id that the ego becomes an effective agency from which interest in objects would then arise. Or is it, on the contrary, on the basis of an object forged in the id that the ego manages to become imbued with value secondarily, qua semblable, just like certain other objects supposedly do? That's what requires us to formulate the whole question of identification. The neurotic finds himself confronted with narcissistic problems because he wants to be the one in the field of the other. Idealization plays a primordial logical role here. But simply by making this remark, I'm suggesting at the same time that we investigate the nature of primary narcissism. Isn't it just a figment of Freud's imagination? Aren't we, along with him, undergoing a retroactive effect that is image-based and even unspeakably skewed? Aren't we overdoing things a little bit, just enough to fall into the neurotic's trap? Next time, I will try to convey that it is at the level of secondary narcissism in its characteristic form of imaginary capture that the problem of object A arises for neurotics, in a way that is altogether different from the way it arises for perverts. We believe we can assume that the neurotic must have had some relation, not of supplementation, but of complementation to the one. And we attribute this to the oral drive. Nevertheless, and in a way that is quite apparent on condition that we get over our fascination with neurosis, the oral drive also happens to be centered around a third object that slips away and is just as hard to get a handle on as the gaze or voice. The breast, that famous object, is, with the help of a play on words, turned into the mother's womb, Breast also means womb. But behind the breast, and just as plastered like a veneer onto the wall that separates the child from the mother as it is, we find the placenta. It is there to remind us that a child in the womb does not constitute a single body with its mother, for the child is not even enclosed in her uterine envelopes. The child is not a normal egg, but is broken in the envelopes by the aforementioned plastering or plating. Moreover, as we now know, it is owing to the latter that all sorts of conflicts can occur that arise from a mixing of blood between mother and fetus and from the incompatibility of blood types. It thus appears that when it comes to the drive, something cannot be eliminated. A third object that I called a veneer or a pennant, I would also say, for we shall see it again in eminent forms in every cultural product, in the thing that is attached to the wall that lures us. Isn't this, in fact, what appears in the neurotic's experience? Right? Which is to try to cover it up with the myth of primal unity, a lost paradise, supposedly put an end to by the trauma of birth. Isn't that to fall precisely into what is at work in the neurotic's case? Indeed, what is at stake for him is the impossibility of making object A return to the imaginary level in conjunction with the narcissistic image. The first lines of this are already sketched out quite clearly in the article I mentioned, and I'll return to it to articulate this point in detail. No representation props up the presence of what is known as the representative of representation. We see only too clearly here the distance implied by this term. A representative is not at all the same as a representation. This is what allows me to indicate that all of this reordered on the third line of the graph, one that crosses the other two. It is, strictly speaking, what? Based on a symbolic concatenation, is related to the imaginary, where it finds its ballast. It is along that line that, in the complete graph, you find the ego, desire, fantasy, and lastly, the specular image. Before we find, at the lower left, the tip of the arrow, which can only be grasped on the basis of a retroactive effect. It is there that the retroactive illusion of primary narcissism is inscribed. We will have to re-enter the problem of the neurotic around that. It also manifests the fact that sublimation is doomed to fail in the subject, qua neurotic. Thus, if my formula, barred subject losange small a, barred s losange little a, qua formula of fantasy must be foregrounded with regard to sublimation, I must first critique a whole series of side implications that were unjustifiably derived from this, owing to the fact that analysts' experience of the signifier's impact on the subject involved work with neurotics. The fact remains that this experience could not have taken place otherwise. Okay. So he's saying that the neurotic subject has a stunted relationship to narcissism, having to do with the fact that for the neurotic, well, there's a relationship between primary narcissism, or capital A, right, in the lower part of the graph of desire, that is not transcendable or not able to be overcome. An object A. So that's very interesting. And again, all of this, by the way, I put the PDF if you want to do supplementary reading before next time, because you see here, look, where we go to right here. This is the big section that is very interesting that we go to next time on the Schmergel text, the conservative Freudian text. By the way, if you read the introduction of the Schmergel text, you'll see it's by Christopher Lasch, who writes the introduction. So it's very subtle, and I can say a few things about it maybe next time, and we can But I encourage you guys to read it. I put the PDF in our Slack. I think it's a quite interesting debate. But let's get back into all of these things, and maybe even if you wanted to get very ambitious, we could go back and read remarks on Daniel Lagash's presentation from the Écrit to understand this distinction between, identification in Freud and primary narcissism. It's like, that famous Freudian dialectic between primary and secondary narcissism. Because if you read The Culture of Narcissism, you'll understand the core claim of Christopher Lasch is that late capitalism is actually producing a crisis of secondary narcissism. And that's like the whole, basically the, like there's forces of capitalist society that are stunting what is otherwise a healthy dialectic between primary and secondary narcissism. It's worth looking at. Lasch doesn't rely only on Schmergel, by the way, in his analysis. Because I know that a lot of people have they think that Lasch is some kind of like reactionary psychoanalytic thinker. I don't think that he is, by the way. I don't know if you guys have an opinion on that, but
I'm really
go ahead.
sorry. Yeah, I'm just like not gamed up in Lash. He's on the list. Along with a lot of people. But yeah, if I understand what you're saying, like, is Lash then making a claim that because of this inability to complete secondary narcissism or something like this, that we then have the proliferation of neuroticism, or would it be the proliferation of like something else, or could it even arrive at such a category of subjectivity?
No. He works on like the primary influence that because he's not like a clinician, but his primary clinical influence is Otto Kernberg's theory of pathological narcissism. And the argument is that it gives rise to a series of personality and behavioral tendencies in the culture, which revolve around a series of like common symptoms, common effects, like a propensity of crisis of attention, a propensity towards aggressivity, a propensity towards crisis over authority. So he's like sort of pointing to how, in a similar way to a lot of post-Lacanian authors, will show that late capitalism is a drive-based capitalism precisely because of the superego injunction to enjoy. That's actually very close to what Lasch is also talking about, this kind of post-68 lifting of prohibitions around access to immediate enjoyment. So there's a whole question about immediacy and enjoyment that's at play there. So it's actually like pretty close to a theory of society and social power that Lacan is working with as well. You can read Schmergel's text. Most of it's actually like a really, really uncharitable take on Wilhelm Reich. But of course, the name Wilhelm Reich is not mentioned once by Lacan, which I find interesting. Not exactly sure why. But that's like literally what the whole book is about. He doesn't mention it once. So anyways, we can discuss next week. It's a bit interesting controversy to explore. There are a few things that Lasch says in the introduction to the text that bother me deeply, by the way. We can explore that. Because he writes the introduction to the Schmergel text, and I have a big problem with some of the things he says. Anyways, good session. Any other final thoughts before we bounce?
Not really a thought, just an observation. That might be a good place to end. He opens the session that we just read by mentioning like first truths, primary truths. That's like the first sentence. And in the first session, of the seminar, when he's talking about the il pleut, it rains, it is raining, right after that, he'll say il pleut de vérité première. So it's raining primary truths. And then he says il y a de l'abus, like there is abuse. So I think there's a whole like phenomenological tradition of the il y a, the es gibt, the there is, of like what is given in perception. So I was just wondering about maybe like what these first truths are in reference to, if it's about perversion. There's this text by Jacques-Alain Millet where he says that, where he references the three essays on sexuality, and right, how the original drives in infancy would be polymorphously perverse, but then he's saying that the structure of perversion wouldn't be raw, but it would be cooked, so that there is something about the givenness of abuse in capitalism, and like, I guess, perversion as a structure, or as like I don't know, a horizon or a fantasy that allows to contain it or to trap people's jouissance within the boundaries. I don't know. I'm rambling a bit, but
No, it's good. Yeah. That is an interesting question, which is, in what way is the perverse subject aiming to truth? That is an interesting point. On the one hand, I think on the other hand, he's also saying first truths, is he not, of first truths refers simply to his own discourse, precisely because he goes through a review of some of his fundamental claims, right, regarding the operation of the graph of desire and so on. So it's probably a combination of both. But yeah, because I guess also, it's also true, Aaron, is it not, that the perverse subject, while Lacan will call them moronic or idiotic, they are defenders of the faith, but they're also then therefore defenders of the truth. Are they not? So there's also this idea that they yeah. Anyways, that's a very interesting set of reflections.
it might be, just to add one more thing. Mila mentioned something that, like, for neurotic, desire is a question. So they're perplexed as to what they want, versus the pervert has an answer, but is perplexed by the answer that they, I don't know, have a strong conviction to, or are like instrumentalized by, perhaps, or made into instruments of.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very, very well said. Yeah. No, it makes sense though. Yeah. The pervert is a very philosophical subject. Matilda.
Yeah, I wanted to mention like this Freud or Reich text with the author who has the long last name, that the traditional psychoanalyst. I read like the first half of it before it gets into like the Reich part, and it's a really interesting confrontation with Marxism, especially like initially. It's like a lot of the discussion is, I mean, there is the question of primary narcissism and like rejoining back up with it, but there's also just at the very beginning of it where they take the Engels quote of like, what is false consciousness? It's like mistaking motives for seeing, like it's like thinking that something is caused by these seeming motive forces that are incorrect. And I mean, Engels gestures towards external factors as being primary, and Bergler or whatever, I'm sorry, whatever this author's name is I mean, puts the heavy emphasis on internal factors and said that Freud is within the tradition of internal factors as the reason for false consciousness, which is an extremely like intent, like coming for, if you think Marxism has any like purport to truth, like it's an intense assault upon it. I mean, they also say that it's also in line in some regard to what Engels said. It's just that Engels had it wrong. You know, like there is ideology, but it's from internal factors. You can, anyway, you can mistake the causation and be an ideologist because you didn't recognize the proper factors in the situation. And so there is this question to me, like of like, are being and consciousness separate things? Does one exist without the other? Like, just like these primary basic, like kind of maybe even epistemological questions about the reality of our existence. Is the Marxist claim that there's like a being separate from consciousness some sort of delusion to psychoanalysts? I don't know. The text really was provocative and raised a lot of questions. I have a few quotes I'll post in the chat because they're like extremely provocative in a way. But
yeah. Well, I guess the point is goes back to the Lashian point. Why Lash has solidarity with the text is precisely because there's a dialectic that they perceive on behalf of the rebels of 68, which is that they rebel in a desire for a refusion with primary narcissism, which is their theory of utopia. So there's a utopianism which desires for a refusion of harmony, and then they fail. And in the failure, there is an aggression that emerges, which creates a kind of great disorder in the social bond, in the social. So therefore, it's a pessimistic text on leftism, ultimately, which I can't tolerate that myself, like on a matter of principle. So I'm opposed to their reading. But I'm not going to call them reactionary because I do think that, yeah, like you say, Matilda, there's something maybe worth looking at there, you know? It's kind of one of those questions like of, yeah, it's worth, go ahead, Luis.
So in the last session, well, if it can be think as a session, Lacan was talking about the liberal power and how one in the liberal power, one can resign of one's job, right? And it makes me think, you know, I mean, how can that relate to that, to the logic of perversion? I mean, my hypothesis is that, I mean, if you resign, I mean, the traditional conservative subject was not less of a pervert, right? But by resigning, what happens in capitalism, you are more in depth into capitalism, right? And I think the logic of capitalism is almost like only if you become a masochist, you can enjoy, right? Or on the other hand, a sadist, right? It's like you reject this conservative role, but then you believe more by rejecting it. You believe more into your individualistic life. You're more in depth into capitalism. It's very much more perverted, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think the other reason is that the capitalist discourse itself does not require castration. It does not require the sacrifice. And we remember that part of the prop of the pervert is in avoidance of that castration act. So it promises a fulfillment without that sacrifice, and that becomes an easy way out or something like that. It becomes a cheapened form of yeah, like a commodified form of which would then basically say that, like, yeah, you can yeah, displace it all onto another site or onto a sadistic structure. But it also, frankly, doesn't necessarily need to produce that in subject. It also usually produces, like Byung-Chul Han talks about, like passivity and depression and dejection and so on, right? Which is much different than, I think, these structures of perversion. Even
But
though
when he talks about
yeah,
when he talks about the
go-
burnout society, isn't that like a sadomasochistic subjectivity?
it is, but it's not a subjectivity that produces like mad people or psychotics and like, but that, see, that's actually one of the things that I think is interesting, which is that in the time of Deleuze and Lacan, they were talking about like capitalism and psychosis. And now like the thing that is much more present is perversion, not psychosis, I would say. So this is something for us to consider. And we really need 17 and the math teams of sort of the discourses to fully get a handle on that, I feel. But maybe we can do that again at some point in the future. But yeah, read the Reich text, guys. I think you will get a lot out of it, without question. Shall we break? What do we have from Akshay? Return of Fetishism, Charles de Brosses and the Afterlives of an Idea. Interesting. Thank you.
It's an interesting book because I mean in this, I mean, I don't know, but basically like it's a translation of the tract from which the term fetishism first came. And then it's sort of following the movement of the idea through several discourses, from first like this critique of Africanity in a kind of colonial discourse to sort of anthropology to Marxism to psychoanalysis. And the interesting sort of argument she makes is that in both Marxism and psychoanalysis, it serves a sort of critical role as a kind of discourse about disavowal.
Yeah, we also have Alenka Zupanchik's new book, Disavowal, right? I want to look into that text this summer. Looks super good. Okay, well, listen, guys, we could go on for ages and ages, but we should probably break. Yeah, look forward to seeing everybody on Discord. Until next time. All the best. Okay, peace. See you guys. Thanks.